This is the ISR's 25th book launch in the series that we started at the end of the pandemic year 2020. And I have to say it's our first blockbuster textbook. So hold up. It has 39 chapters, nearly as many contributors. It's very difficult to lift, as we can see right now. The fact that nobody's showing it. And it's also unimaginably rich in the scope and diversity of the thinking contained between its covers. It covers a global range of thinkers about politics, and it will serve as a foundational text for students. And its author's ideas about politics will likely act as a reference for these students throughout their lives. It will give any reader a new sense of the diversity as well as the depth of political thought. And it might help its readers face their political lives with unexpected feelings of interest and even pleasure, rather than as something like my own baseline reactions to politics of mistrust and dread. Many of us in the Anglo-American world enter politics under duress. Political discourse seems the realm of deception and spin, of manipulation and lying, typified by the Brexit bus that said £350 million a week for the NHS, or by the more mundane inability of any politician on BBC Radio 4 to give a direct answer to the question they were actually asked. In the US democracy that I grew up in, money talks, not political theory, and so does the marketing of reductive fantasy. So my boring but actually rational candidates were routinely defeated by demagogues, typified by the first presidential campaign in which I could vote, where Jimmy Carter was crushed by Ronald Reagan. Politics seems to give free rein to paranoid projections onto the racial or sexual other, to the scapegoating of powerless populations, to mass submission to authoritarian masculinity. In contrast to this reality, politics should be the realm of life in common in which we decide collaboratively how we will live together. It should be the realm of nonviolent debate, of comprehension across difference, of the setting of the rules of mutual governance according to procedures of consent. But democracy itself often seems like a con, when it is not simply a theater of racist projection or a call to violence. And yet, settling into a few of these chapters in this new book, I felt the power of political thinking as an antidote to political practice. The book helps decolonize political thought. It expresses this thought's seriousness, its rigor, and its scale. It brings thinkers into unexpected juxtaposition, striking sparks. Manjeet, for example, brings together Aristotle and bell hooks. Patricio Longo links Socrates and Plato to sojourner truth. The battle of theory against our political inertia is engaged again, and likely to goad and inspire a new generation to take actions of their own. Okay, Manjeet and Simon's project resonates with some of the first IRS launches of our fellows' books. To remind some of you who've been with us for the duration, Annalene de Dang argued in her book, Freedom, that the only truly valuable form is democratic freedom and not the negative individualist kind, even as Western rulers have generally marginalized the democratic form. In his book, An African Path to Disability Justice, Oche Onazi redefined disability justice through Ubuntu, a relational, not individualist notion of personhood, one that, in Oche's revisionist reading, obliges societies to respect asymmetrical capabilities rather than taking advantage of them. In his book, Victory, Kean O'Driscoll argued that to the extent that just war actually exists, which it may well not, it must emerge from a collective decision process that bears in mind a nation or group's relation to the appointed enemy. In Being Sure of Each Other, Kimberly Brownlee offered detailed philosophical reasons for why social rights are more fundamental than individual rights, which means we need a deep democratic restructuring of interpersonal relations. In his book on Hungary, Gabor Shearing showed the readiness with which liberal market relations can be turned into authoritarian capitalism, and the need for mass vigilance against the strongman creation of an accumulative state. Although any set of ISRF fellows would, were they all here today, disagree on all sorts of things from their diverse disciplines, they are mounting a collective challenge to 19th century liberal individualism, to its colonial projects, and to the neoliberal updates that have shaped the world in part through nearly continuous military violence. Okay, so as Lars was suggesting, we're going to hear first from our two editors for about 20 minutes or so. Well, we're always flexible here, ISRF launches. And then from each of our commentators. So Manjeet and Simon will have a first shot at a response to the comments. And then we will open it up to you as soon as we can. So Manjeet, are you going to go first?
Yes. Yeah.
All right. So I will introduce you, each of you individually. Manjeet Ramgotra is a senior lecturer in political thought in the Department of Politics and International Studies at SOAS University of London. She has been a fellow of the ISRF and was a visiting, she's kind of a perma-fellow, I have to say is more accurate, and it was a visiting researcher at the School of Politics and International Relations at Queen Mary University, London. Her research examines the history of Republican ideas extending from classical European to 20th century anti-colonial political thought. She is the author of articles on republicanism, including Time, Modernity, and Space, Montesquieu's and Constant's Ancient Modern Binaries, Republican Empire and Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, India's Republican Moment, Freedom in Nehru's Political Thought. She has also published work on decolonizing the curriculum and is co-editor of a work on that subject, Decolonizing Curricula and Pedagogy in Higher Education, which came out with Routledge in 2021. Currently, she is working on a project on post-colonial republicanism in India. She is a trustee on the Political Studies Association Executive Committee and a member of the Center for Comparative Political Thought at SOAS. Manjeet, over to you. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris, and welcome everyone. And thank you for that very warm welcome. It's a real pleasure to be here and quite a thrill to be launching this book that Simon and I have been working on for many years. Before I start, I'd like to thank the ISRF, the Independent Social Research Foundation, for hosting this book launch and also for providing all the free copies of the book. I'd like to thank Despoina, Stuart, Lars, and Chris for organizing tonight's event. Rethinking Political Thinkers is a textbook that brings together a range of marginalized and mainstream political thinkers. It organizes these according to core concepts and themes that are central to thinking and theorizing about politics. The book is not ordered chronologically, as we neither tell a story about progress or the historical development of ideas over time, nor do we present it as a canon of so-called great thinkers. Before handing over to Simon, I thought I would talk a little bit about the genesis of the book that is inspired by our teaching. And I'm delighted to see so many of the students that I have taught this course to who are here tonight, so which is wonderful. Anyway, after several years of teaching fairly standard history of political thought modules, I decided to introduce more women and people of color into the curriculum. So I often co-taught my courses, and we began to introduce thinkers such as Mary Astill, a 17th century British feminist or woman political theorist, Carol Pateman, a very well-known political theorist who is a contemporary thinker, Gandhi and Fanon. Then we began to put these critical and marginalized thinkers in conversation with mainstream ones. As Chris mentioned, we put together bell hooks and Aristotle, or at least I did, on what is the political and what are its boundaries. This work on the curriculum coincided with the Rhodes Must Fall movement and other work on bringing women, Black thinkers, anti-colonial, post- and decolonial thinkers into the foreground of our research and teaching in politics and international relations. And there's a lot of work that's been done on that, and one of the big works is by Kimberly Hutchings, Patricia Owens, Katerina Reitzler, and Sarah Dunstan on, it's a big project on women's international thought. The desire to include political theory from beyond the Western canon of dead white European men also coincided with the development of comparative political theory, which was fast becoming a recognized subdiscipline of political theory. Comparative political thought presented new approaches to reading and studying political theory through the concepts and political thinking produced in the global South and by the global majority. And here I mean global South in a large sense, where I include also parts of the so-called West as being in the sort of state, if you like, of the global South. So they're marginalized areas in the West as well that would be considered as sharing that kind of a geography of place and positionality. So those are some of the areas that inspired some of the thinking behind the book. Scholars doing research and teaching in this area introduced comparative political thought into the mainstream of the Western academy. For example, the institution where I teach, SOAS, created a postgraduate degree in comparative political thought. To be sure, this coincided with degrees in global politics, but these were more about universalist, liberal, and Eurocentric ways of understanding international politics, and less about the formation of local ideas from the global South that push back against the imposition of universal norms. Nevertheless, the question remains as to why we, as political theorists, are not teaching thinkers such as Gandhi, Edward Said, and Angela Davis, who have had enormous impact on present-day political thinking and activism, or in more formal terms, on political theory and practice. As we began to change our teaching to include a wider range of thinkers, we also began to talk and to write about it. This led to wider conversations with colleagues in the Political Studies Association Women in Politics Specialist Group, and colleagues at universities of Bristol, Goldsmiths, Kingston, Queen Mary, and at SOAS, where we set up a decolonizing SOAS working group. So across many of these institutions, we began this conversation about decolonizing the curriculum and including a greater diversity of voices, but not just to include people for the sake of including them, but to rethink the structures and that hold the hierarchies and inequalities of in place, including gender, racial, disability, sexuality, and class inequalities. So, as I said, some of these conversations focused on how to develop and transform the curriculum without tacking on a week on feminism or a week on post-colonialism at the end of a course that would otherwise spend most of its time studying the canon from Plato to Nato. Indeed, such approaches reinforce the gender and race inequalities by indicating that some are more important than others. Therefore, we put marginalized and mainstream thinkers together and examined core concepts such as freedom, equality, silencing as an exercise of power, and consent as a tool to liberate some, but also it is used to oppress others. This approach of studying political thinkers of diverse and divergent perspectives on core political concepts and themes give students the opportunity to develop critical thinking, critical analysis, and an understanding of the justifications of the values that underpin our political structures and lives. From the transformation of our teaching, we developed our textbook that does not recreate a canon, but rather that reimagines the field and discipline of political theory writ large. Thank you very much.
Next up, Simon Choat took his PhD in politics from Queen Mary University, London, and is an associate professor and head of the Department of Economics at Kingston University in the Faculty of Business and Social Sciences. He has taught at Kingston since 2010, having previously taught at the University of Reading. His recent research topics include contemporary anarchism, the critique of Ernesto Laclau, the theories of new materialists such as Bruno Latour, the work of the American philosopher Michael Sandel, comparisons of the rival approaches to understanding neoliberalism and decolonizing political theory. He has published 2 previous books, Marx Through Post-Structuralism, Lyotard, Derrida, Foucault, Deleuze, which came out in 2010, which analyzed the ways in which these 4 thinkers read, used, and criticized Marx's work, and Marx's Grundrisse, A Reader's Guide, which came out in 2016. His many articles include The Iron Cage of Enterprise, or The Restoration of Class Power, which argues for a synthesis of Marx and Foucault in the analysis of neoliberalism, Science, Agency, and Ontology, a historical materialist response to new materialism, Decolonizing the Political Theory Curriculum, and Tuition Fees and the Neoliberal University. In addition to a range of scholarly affiliations, he is a member of Kingston's Political Economy Research Group and serves on the editorial advisory board of the journal Global Discourse. Simon.
Thank you. So listening to that introduction to my research makes me think I need to decolonize my research a bit, because it's just a sort of list of white men, Sandel, Latour, Derrida, etc. So I'll work on that. Like Manjeet, I'd also like to thank the ISRF for this launch. I'd like to thank everyone for coming. I'd like to thank the contributors to our book, some of whom are here today. And I'd also like to thank Manjeet, because I'd say she was the driving force behind the book. It wouldn't have happened without her. So I won't add too much to what Manjeet has said already, but I'm just going to talk a bit about the contents of the book, Manjeet having talked about its genesis. So this is what we were facing, and this is what, I mean, the book is to be used by people like us who teach politics, and it's expected to be used on a sort of second-year undergrad course, Introductions to Politics and Modern Political Thought. But this is the standard curriculum, and this is the sort of stuff I myself would have been teaching about a decade ago. So the sort of standard canon runs from Machiavelli in the top left there to rules in bottom right, and then sometimes it gets updated a bit with some critiques of rules. And then occasionally there's a token woman in the canon, like Wollstonecraft. And then very occasionally there might be like a week on multiculturalism or something thrown in at the end. So what we wanted to do was not to stop teaching these thinkers and not to exclude them from the book, but to contextualize them appropriately and to put them alongside other thinkers. And when I used to teach this stuff, I mean, I teach at a university which has a very diverse student body, so a lot of BA&E students, and I would stand in front of the students every year and say, these are the thinkers we're going to study. I would look out and see a lot of faces that were not white, and I would feel like I had to apologise to them for not including any non-white thinkers. And then after a couple of years, I realised I can stop apologising and I can actually change it myself. But I think that shows the kind of weight of the canon and the sort of the difficulties of changing this stuff and the sort of inertia within political thought. It is quite difficult to change it. So having changed it, the courses we were teaching would look a bit more like this. So, for example, as we have in the book, we'd still do the classic social contract thinkers of Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau. But we'd also have a week or a chapter on Pateman and Charles Mills and criticising social contract theory. And then we bring in thinkers like Du Bois and Angela Davis, Schiller and Firestone, all of whom have chapters in the book. So this is the contents of the book. And I suppose we see it as being distinctive in three ways. So firstly, as I said, we retain the sort of classic white male thinkers of the canon, but we put them into, or we read them in the contexts of imperialism, capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy. Alongside those, the dead white men of the classic canon, we've also included a range of hitherto suppressed or forgotten or marginalized thinkers and voices. And you can guess who they are from the slide. And then, as Manjeet was alluding to, we also decided not to arrange or organise the book chronologically, but to do it thematically. And in some cases, we read thinkers against and alongside each other. So Aristotle with bell books, for example. And a lot of this stuff came from Manjeet, actually. I should give credit to Manjeet, because this is how I think she sets up her own module. And the point of doing this is not because we think there are eternal concepts in political thought or eternal debates, but because we think there are concepts, ideas, arguments which are recurrent and which reappear through the history of political thought, but in different ways, in very different contexts. And we also think reading thinkers like Aristotle and bell books together allows us to focus on the positionality and the importance of positionality for their ideas, and to get students, therefore, to think about positionality. I mean, as you can see, there's still quite a lot of, it's still quite European focused. And that's for a number of reasons, I suppose. Partly it is kind of a compromise. So, and that's a compromise with the reviewers of the book. We're very, very pleased with the book. I should say that first. But there were compromises we had to make with the reviewers of the book and with our editors at OUP in terms of what we included. So there were some, for example, African thinkers that we were going to include, but which we didn't on the advice of our reviewers and editors. I don't think that's giving too much away. So. And then there's also compromises. Ultimately it's a textbook, and so it has to appeal to, we want people to buy it and use it on their courses. And so it couldn't be too radically different from, we want to change what people are teaching, but it can't be too radically different from what people are already doing. But I think there's also a political or normative reason for it, and that is the book is not about simply moving to the margins, but it's about showing the imbrication of the centre and the margins. Okay? And many of these thinkers embody or reflect that. So, Gandhi and Fanon, for example, whom we have in the section of Violence, Power and Resistance, they are thinkers of the global south, but they are also, in a sense, European thinkers in a way, because they're fighting against European empires, but they're also subjects of those European empires themselves. Or if you take a thinker like Du Bois, he's an American, so he's a kind of Euro-American thinker, but he is also, in a sense, a thinker of the global South, in terms of his positionality and in terms of his arguments as well. Among the sort of discussions we had when deciding on who to include, so as Manjeet has already suggested, we had to think about the difference between decolonising and comparative political thought. So, as we say in the introduction, comparative political thought and the arguments and ideas coming from comparative political thought certainly fed into what we were doing, but it's not a textbook of comparative political thought. And we understand decolonising as something different from comparative political thought, in the sense that I was just explaining, in that it doesn't mean it means showing the implication of the centre and the margins and the way they fit together, and so including someone like Hobbes or Locke or Kant, but to decolonise them, to set them in the contexts of European empires. We were also careful in the introduction, and I think throughout, to talk about political thought rather than political theory or political philosophy. And that's partly because we wanted to emphasise that political thought comes from it comes in a variety of forms. I mean, even in the classic thinkers, like Marx and Rousseau, it comes in the form of novels and manifestos, essays, dialogues, etc., etc. It's not just a book or a peer-reviewed article. But it also comes from a variety of sites and in a great variety of forms. So, I mean, we start with Sojourner Truth in the first chapter. But there's a sense in which she wouldn't meet the classical standards of what political theory is taken to be, in the terms of the way in which she formulates her argument. Okay? But we see her obviously as a political thinker, and a highly influential and important and significant political thinker. So we refer to political thought. And I think it's fair to say that, as well as, we wanted to break the hegemony of not just the kind of white male canon, but I think also of analytic philosophy as well, analytic political philosophy in particular. So, existing textbooks, many of which are very good, and which I've certainly used myself and given to my students. In the introduction, when they introduce students to what political thought, political theory is, it's basically rules. Yeah? And they talk about rules and critics of rules, and it's Anglo-American normative political philosophy. And we wanted to get away from that as well, I think. Okay. Yeah, I think that's about all I wanted to say. And so we started work on this 2019, I think. Yeah. So in some ways, I'm really pleased with the book and really pleased with this event. I'm also kind of sick of the book. So, I'm much more interested in what other people have to say and what other people think about the book. So I'll try.
We now have two commentators talking about the book. So our first is Kevin O'Koth, who received his BA at SOAS and an MPhil in political theory from the University of Oxford. He has worked in the world of nonprofit social enterprise and is currently an independent writer and researcher who speaks on anti-imperialism and 20th century anti-colonial movements. He is a founding editor of Nomo Mag and serves on the editorial collective of the journal Salvage. He is also currently a contributing editor for LRB. He is the author of Red Africa, Reclaiming Revolutionary Black Politics, due out with Verso Press in October, in which through readings of the revolutionary black politics of Eduardo Mondlane, Amilcar Cabral, Walter Rodney, and Andre Blouin, he shows that the intellectual and political tradition he calls Red Africa generated new synergies between Marxism and black radicalism. Kevin, it's a pleasure to have you.
I'll try and keep my remarks relatively brief, but although I graduated from my BA a very long time ago, I'm kind of here also in my capacity as Manjeet's former student, as someone who has taken this course and kind of wanted to speak a little bit about what it kind of meant to me, basically what it meant to me and how it helped me think about political thought. It kind of mirrors, so the Introduction to Political Theory course that I took at SOAS kind of basically had a similar structure to this in terms of kind of starting with some of the classic political thinkers, but then going into conversation with people like Frantz Fanon, Aristotle, etc. So we could kind of see how their debates kind of link to each other while not directly talking to each other. And I thought that was super, super helpful for me. I got to write my first kind of undergraduate essay in political theory on Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. It's something that still informs my political thought and practice to this day. And it was one of the most interesting things I could do, and I could do that as a first-year undergraduate in political theory, basically in politics, which I think was so rare. And I was looking around other courses I could have done at the time, and none of that was a possibility at pretty much most other institutions. So following on from that, I had a very particular idea of, what I thought what political thought was. So I went and did an MPhil in political theory at the University of Oxford and found out that most people think something quite different of what political theory is. So I spent a year my first year doing a lot of kind of analytic political theory, which has been spoken about, kind of the Anglo-American thinkers, and then specifically stuff related to Rawlsian thought. But I think what was important for me when I arrived there is that I already had the resources from this previous course to be able to deconstruct kind of like what the assumptions were that fed into these normative political theories. So I could look at Rawls and say, what did he forget? What does he leave out? What is not mentioned in kind of this particular normative political framework? And it's because having done kind of this comparative and almost like decolonized political theory, thought curriculum, that I could have the resources to kind of be like, oh, this is what Fanon might say about something like this, or this is what Angela Davis might say about something like this. So I thought that was like really, really important for me to kind of come through that course and be able to get almost more from it because I could basically do that critique already. It always seems like an obvious statement, and I think in disciplines like political theory or when thinking about political thought, but I think it is always worth emphasizing, and it's always worth emphasizing again and again, that a lot of these historical figures or that are treated merely as historical figures sometimes were political thinkers, and I think this is something I came across a lot about in terms of anti-colonial thought, for example, is that everyone was just treated as a historical actor who produced political action, but never as a political thinker who produced thought. And I think Lewis Gordon, a philosopher based in the US, makes this point very well. But yeah, I kind of eventually left the discipline of political theory because there was a lack of kind of engagement with these thinkers and also professional capacity because there weren't any supervisors. Many supervisors were able to supervise work on the diversity of some of the thinkers that were mentioned here. So it kind of makes it very, very difficult to continue doing that work. So I think what this book will do is actually provide a very, very useful resource, not just for students, but also for people teaching these courses to kind of almost make a new generation of people working in these fields to be able to teach kind of a diversity of what political thought can be. I also wanted to briefly, if I'm not going on too long, talk about, I kind of helped compile some of the online resources for this book, which involved writing about almost more than 40 biographies, short biographies of these thinkers. And it's one of the most rewarding pieces of work I've done. It's because putting them into conversation required a lot of cross-referencing. So it's kind of the cross-referencing always made you think about different thinkers and what they would have thought of each other and what they would have said about each other at particular points in time. And I think the thing that it teaches us, this textbook, is kind of to avoid, I guess, to historicize political thinkers, and kind of avoid this difficulty of making an anachronistic point about, let's say someone is saying something in 1960 when the political conversation is different, and someone was saying something in ancient Greece, and you can kind of make them have a conversation without being anachronistic about it and saying they're talking about exactly the same thing. So I think it's, for example, the useful conversations we have in this. It's the many different conversations on the subject of slavery, for example, where we have Frederick Douglass speaking about that subject. And then we have a chapter that kind of discusses Aristotle's views on slavery, which are fundamentally different historical contexts, but there's something linking that conversation about the use of unfree labor in particular societies. And then I kind of briefly wanted to finish with kind of thinking about, I guess, making a point of how relevant some of these, even some of these thinkers are to actually more contemporary kind of like, I would say, kind of in fashion debates around subjects in political theory and political thought. I guess the one that has been mentioned, of course, is just ideas around decolonization, decolonial theory, and all those subjects. So it's, when you kind of start and you have an engagement with the Fanon or something like that, then it kind of gives you a basis to understand that conversation. There's the other debate about family abolition or reproductive justice, for example. So we have Firestone in the book, who's kind of a fundamental thinker or like a pivotal thinker for that subject. And then I think the last, Black feminist thought and prison abolition, for example. We've got Angela Davis in here, so it kind of taps into the contemporary conversations that students are having outside of the classroom, but kind of actually making them and helping them link those up with the political thinkers they've learned about. And then I think the third one that's also really, really important is that last section, which I thought was very, very important, is kind of basically how do we treat non-human actors in the environment in political theory, which has historically often been a very humanist discipline. I mean, just to conclude, I think it's interesting because it's almost, it's a textbook, but it cannot never be like a definitive statement of what rethinking political thinkers is, because there will always be new names added to this, because it's a sort of like, it's not a canon, it's a sort of anti-canon that kind of, I guess, you can kind of keep on adding people to and keep on putting them into conversation with each other. So I think, personally, I'm really excited to kind of hear about how students receive this textbook, what they think about it, what thinkers they think should be brought into these conversations, because, again, it's never a complete kind of textbook. It can always bring up new conversations. And I think this will kind of play a crucial role in like shaping the disciplines of political theory, study of comparative political thought over the next few years, and I think it will help these disciplines keep their priorities in line with the political problems that we're actually facing in the world today. Thank you.
Iniola Anuoluwapo Soyemi took her PhD in political philosophy from Boston University and is currently departmental lecturer in political philosophy and public policy in the School of Government at Oxford University. Her research covers African and contemporary political, moral, and legal philosophy. She works on questions of freedom, injustice, democracy, deliberative and participatory practice, authority, and equalities of power. In these areas, she is especially interested in advancing general conceptual understanding by paying attention to the modern and contemporary histories of African societies and to the ideas of key African thinkers and philosophers, including Kwasi Wiredu, Steve Biko, and Zara Yacob. She is also interested in cross and multidisciplinary methodological approaches to normative political philosophy and theory, and in the discipline of political philosophy itself. Her articles include Doing African Political Philosophy from a Universalist Perspective and Participation in and Law's Authority. Her first book in process is entitled Law's Moral Legitimacy, Historical Participation and the Quest for a General Jurisprudence. Over the course of her career, she has worked with Professor Nida Crawford on developing the African focus of the Costs of War project at Brown University. And before entering academia, she worked at Chatham House and then at the Guardian newspaper, where she was based in the press lobby of the UK House of Commons. Neola, welcome and thank you for that.
So first, thank you so much to ISRF and Manjeet and Simon for having me. It's great to be involved in the launch of such an important textbook. So I'm going to start with basic. So I gave, what do they call these things?
Endorsement.
for the book. And I remember when I got the email, so my colleagues at Oxford will tell you that this is true. I was like, this is weird. I'm a very junior, lowly departmental lecturer. Why are they asking me to endorse? Something must be wrong. And I remember asking my colleagues, like, should I accept this? And they were just like, of course, like, it's great, and it's OUP, why wouldn't you? So this is basically going to be an extension of some of what I said in that endorsement, and I'm going to follow it up with a couple of challenging comments. They are unfair, because they're basically comments that should be leveled at the discipline as a whole, but you can take them. I think you can take them. You've put together a phenomenal textbook here, and you're trying to do something pretty different, so I think it's fair game. So firstly, I just want to say that what I love about this book is that, to me, it represents the diversity in the discipline in its more substantive meaning. And that means not in the way that people talk about diversity quite frequently nowadays, which is just, well, a lot of the time come to be deployed to mean diversity, both of identity and thought, but not really in a particularly substantive sense, and in ways that often are deployed to hide the fact that actually, if you look closer, nothing much has changed underneath. So this book doesn't do that. And to me, that's what's really, really good about it, is diversity meaningfully wielded. And so we've got, as you can see from what Simon's got up, we've got thinkers like putting Aristotle and Bell Hooks together. We've got Angela Davis and Frederick Douglass alongside Rawls and Kant. And we've got indigenous ecologies, and we've got C.L.R. James and Saeed Qutb. And so that's fantastic. But what fascinates me even more than the array of thoughts that are put together in this book is the substantively, and by which I mean methodologically. I'm pretty obsessed with method, if anybody has met me before. But the ways in which methodologically it brings together radical ways to present these diversity of ideas. And what I mean by this is, if you take a chapter like Aristotle and Bell Hooks, which is Manjeet's chapter, she's going across historically, right? She's doing something that if you're in a standard political theory or political philosophy course, or you're a graduate student from a standard political philosophy theory department, your supervisors will tell you not to do. And they will tell you quite strongly not to do that. It will not be clear why you shouldn't do that, but it will be very clear that you shouldn't do it if you want to be published and if you want to get a job. And she basically says, I've already got a job and I've already been published, so I'm going to do it. But it's also methodologically substantive, because you've got another chapter like Patricia, I love this chapter, Patricia Longo's chapter on Socrates, Plato, and Sojourner Truth. And not only is she inspiring readers to reread and reinterpret Socrates, she's also therefore asking them to question received understandings about Socratic method and Socratic knowledge. You have a chapter, so what I think is also, so one of the things that I really love about this book is the way it combines so many different methodologies in the substantiveness of this diverse representation. So it's not just disbanding with analytical method, as Simon says. It's bringing analytic and historical and cross-historical methods together. And it's bringing together interpretive analysis that are unashamedly unbounded by the discipline. So basically, for me, it's a rebellious book. And I'm a pretty rebellious person, and so I like it. And I think fundamentally also, what I like about it is that it's what philosophy is when I was coming up in grad school. It's the Kool-Aid that I drank, that theory and philosophy were supposed to be rebellious, because the world isn't great. I mean, there might be some people who are looking around going, we've got it sorted, the world's fantastic. These thinkers, the ideas that inform the current way of doing stuff, great, you don't need to do anything else. From my perspective, the world's pretty crap. So there's a lot wrong. right? So we have to rethink things, and there's clearly ideas that aren't working and need to be rethought, and other ideas that are out there that we're not looking at. And this book says, let's look at them. And I think that's pretty much the foundation of what theory and philosophy are meant to do. So that's my good stuff. So my questions, the first one is really a challenge at the comparative method. And that's why I say it's unfair, right? Because it's really the whole sub-discipline of comparative political theory rather than just the book. But you guys are as well placed to answer the question as anybody else. And so I guess, what would you say to those who think, okay, it's a mess, but if we're going to be looking at these diverse array of thought, how do we do it in a way that really takes seriously these other thinkers? And is the comparative method, like when Manjeet compares Aristotle and bell hooks, I love the chapter, but I'm thinking, what would a chapter, and bell hooks is somebody that actually isn't, as alien to the discipline as a number of other thinkers. There are people who do work on bell hooks. But what does it look like to take bell hooks seriously in her own historical context, from her own political viewpoint, because we know about Aristotle a lot. And in fairness to Manjeet's chapter, actually, she makes us rethink what we know about Aristotle by looking at him through bell hooks. So I don't think, like I say, my question is unfair, but I'm leveling it at you nonetheless. So that's one question. And then the other question is somebody who, so it struck me listening to Kevin's comments, and even though I'm a lecturer at Oxford, I can assure you, I'm not one of the lecturers that you will have been taught by for your MPhil. But as someone who's focused in African political thought, it really resonated with me, Simon's candidness about how the compromises that had to be made to get this book together. And one of the challenges that lots of people in African political philosophy and thought are thinking about at the moment is that this focus on decoloniality, the way it goes on Twitter and the surrounding area, seems very superficial. And if decoloniality is really about at least rearranging, if not fully reconstructing the world as we have it now, why aren't we focused on even more radical thinkers? And I know Simon said it's a compromise. You want people to read it, you want people to teach it, you want people to accept it. And I think one of the great things that this book will do, and I completely agree with Kevin, is that I really look forward to meeting the undergrads for whom this was a core textbook, because one, I have to hope that their imagination is just so unbounded that it forces publishers to just publish stuff that they find interesting instead of just what they think adheres to, the correct standards of analytical practice. But nevertheless, part of that imagination surely is hampered by not looking more radically. I mean, there are thinkers that I work on that I know I'm just going to be trying to get that paper published for the next 10 years because nobody is, it's just it's so on the margins. And having thinkers like that, obviously the whole book can't be them, but one or two, because most of these thinkers, even the brown, black, grey, I have nothing, I'm not a racist, so I don't care about the fact that people were white. I don't have anything against dead people, so I don't care about the fact that they're dead. I'm not a sexist, so I don't care about the fact that they're men. But my issue is there are other thinkers who have such amazing things to say, and that's the problem with the old white man stuff, rather than because they're white men, they're dead, right? So how do we get books that are focused on the people that we have almost never looked at, ever? Yeah, thank you.
So the challenges that Eniola makes to us are, I think we accept those challenges and we recognise. But I think we discussed some of those issues when we were creating the book. Especially this issue of how you take thinkers seriously and how you sort of take them seriously in their own context and on their own terms. So, I mean, again, partly, you might not find this a very satisfactory answer, but again, partly it's a pragmatic issue of who our readers are, right? I mean, it's a book written in the English language. It's intended for students. We anticipate that the students who are going to read it are probably in the UK, North America, maybe studying in English in Europe. So I suppose to that extent, there is a little bit of explaining the non-European to the European. But that, I mean, it was something that came up I'll use the Qutb chapter as an example, if you don't mind, whose author is here with us tonight, because that was that was a discussion that came up when we were editing your chapter on Qutb, and when you were writing it, about how you when the reviews came back for that chapter, as you know, the chapter talking about this chapter, where is it? Which section is it? Yeah, Sayyid Qutb in section 3, chapter 15. So you wrote, Aisha wrote a really excellent chapter, and the reviews came back and said, well, they should include more Al-Qaeda, because Qutb is a big influence on Islamist terrorism and on Al-Qaeda. And so you did put that stuff in, and I think it comes at the start, but it was also about, the difficulty was about how to explain this thinker, Qutb, whose ideas are pretty alien from a European, from the perspective of European Enlightenment liberalism. His ideas are quite radical and quite alien. So it's about it's about whether we explain his ideas on his terms or whether we come from a certain perspective, right? Now, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but he defines freedom as recognition of the sovereignty of God's will, basically. And you write about that very well in the chapter, but I suppose then the question is, fine, but I mean, what if you don't accept the sovereignty of God's will? So therefore, it's about thinking about whether Qutb can speak to the non-Islamic world, not because we're prioritising the non-Islamic world, but because we're not all Muslims. So it's partly about trying to put these thinkers into dialogue and put traditions of thought into dialogue, I suppose. But I think we try to avoid coming at it from a too European perspective and simply trying to explain these thinkers, explaining the non-European to the European. But that was something we definitely talked about, and the sort of insights of comparative political thought were quite useful for us then.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
So before I start, thank you very much, Kevin and Eniola, for joining us tonight, for endorsing the book, for doing the biographies and online resources, and also for being my student. Kevin was actually one of the very first discussions we had on the different thinkers to include on the curriculum of Introduction to Political Theory, which is a first-year undergraduate class we teach at SOAS, was about how the curriculum wasn't diverse enough. And that's the one that you took that you were talking about earlier on. And so a lot of students were kind of saying that, Gandhi and Fanon, they're token thinkers. Why don't we have people like Marcus Garvey? And I was teaching with a woman called Banu at the time, and we looked at each other and we were like, we had never heard of Marcus Garvey at the time. So that was way back in 2013. Actually, a decade ago. It's hard to believe. Anyway, the point there was that, we don't know everything, and there are a lot of lacunae in the book, which is, I think, reflective of, what we do know and don't know. And so a lot of thinkers that could be in the book aren't there simply because it takes time and work to do the research and to learn about those thinkers. And Kim, I think you know that, or sorry for putting you over, but Kimberly Hutchins is here. And I know for their work, they did a lot of digging about international women thinkers and finding out about their corpus, their bodies of work, how they produced knowledge through their activism, how they didn't necessarily have written things. So that takes a lot of time to do. And so this is not necessarily that kind of an enterprise. It's bringing in thinkers who are thinkers or who have published works. And so it's around the thinkers. So I think I've gone off on a tangent there, but the point is that there are definitely people missing. But I think your last point on getting other thinkers who have so much interesting work out there and many interesting things to say is really important. That's sort of what I was trying to say too. Like, why don't we study all of these people on an equal playing field? I had a long time ago wanted to do a course on 20th century global thought where you put Mao, Gandhi, Angela Davis, John Rawls, etc., all on the same playing field. So I think that's kind of some of the thinking behind the book. And yes, we could be focused on more radical thinkers, but there are all types of thinkers who come from all over the world who are radical, conservative, or liberal, or middle of the road, if you like. And the book contains many of those. And with each of the thinkers, we wanted to have all of the authors were asked to interrogate them with regard to their ideas on race and gender. So they produced quite critical readings. I think you're absolutely right. There were thinkers on our list. So Steve Biko was someone who I really wanted to include in the book. And that was one of the reviewers said that they didn't have enough intellectual material there to consider that as being part of the canon. So yeah, and Yola actually works on Biko, so that's why I'm mentioning this.
Intellectual material there to consider the thing.
But that again is reflective of the ignorance, that we are knowers who are also ignorant at the same time, or you might think of it in terms of an epistemology of ignorance, or actually that we are structured by the ways we've learned things, and that we have to do a lot of unlearning in order to be open to bringing on thinkers who we don't know, or to learning new things. So I think that's all part of that process. Just very quickly on bell hooks and Aristotle, that was an accident. I had like 10 thinkers on, what is it political, what are its boundaries? And then I thought, oh, that's way too many thinkers. So I pared it down to bell hooks and Aristotle. And then when I actually wrote that lecture, that's when I started to see the comparison in a different light. And I absolutely agree with you. She could easily have a chapter or half of the book to herself, she's a very important thinker, but it was just the way that particular lecture came together. So, and I thought two of the interesting things one is students then could see that you have to read ideas in context, but at the same time, you can compare them across time. So if you take them in their context, it doesn't mean that you can't understand their ideas in those contexts and that you cannot compare those. Yes, sorry, I'm repeating myself across time. And the other thing is students would often say, why are we reading Aristotle? They're so, old from 2,000 years ago. They're not relevant to us today. By putting him together with a more contemporary thinker, then they're actually reading them not only in comparison and contrast to, but also through the eyes of a contemporary thinker, and that's also how they approach it. But then they also need to learn to actually, we do look at things from our own positionalities, but at the same time, we might have to take a few steps back and look at the thinkers in their own context and in their own right, and not impose our meanings on them. So there are a lot of different things that come out of that, which are quite fun. I'll stop there.